Good afternoon, students. American History, US History 1. I have a new lecture for you guys and a new PowerPoint. They'll be uploaded shortly, and when we meet online, we can discuss some of the questions that you have. But for now, we're doing chapter 6, the second part of chapter 6, which is probably the most complicated part of all. Try to understand this well, and we'll be coming back to this issue again and again throughout the rest of the course. Namely, it's an intersection between domestic politics, things that were happening in the United States. The last time around, we were talking about the conflict between the Federalists, namely the vision that Alexander Hamilton had for the country, a vision of a mercantile industrial republic, strong, efficient, centralized. That's why the party was called the Federalists, because they wanted a strong federal government, namely strong presidency. The opposition to that party was led by Thomas Jefferson, who believed that the power should be decentralized, that it would be better if power is vested in the states, and even further into individuals. That's what Jefferson believed. Independent gentlemen farmers. That was a vision that started in the South. Jefferson was a Southerner, a Virginian, and these two visions collided. But that being so, the conflict between the Federalists and the Democrats, or as they're called, Democratic Republicans, was an internal issue for the United States. But it was a part of a larger struggle in the world, namely the French Revolution and the associated events. French Revolution wasn't just a revolution in France. It was a world event. It was a world war between the French revolutionaries and those who opposed them, led by Great Britain and the guy, if you remember, we mentioned him before, William Pitt the Younger, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain and who didn't like the revolution and who tried everything in his power to defeat it and eventually succeeded. So I'm looking at slide number 2 in our PowerPoint. It says French Revolution from 1789 to 1815. Now that's about 11 plus 15, 26 years of revolution from 1789 to 1815. 26 years. That's why the French like to say that the French Revolution is the most important event in modern history. They're probably right. It sets the stage for everything that is going on in politics from that time to today. Development of political parties, as you've seen, the divisions between the Federalists, who eventually decided to be anti-revolution. They didn't like the French Revolution, and the Democratic Republicans, or just Democrats, who liked the French Revolution. So let me just go through the PowerPoint so I can add some more details to these statements. Americans started the Age of Revolutions in 1776, but the Constitution of 1787 and the election of George Washington in 1789 the American Republic assumed a more conservative attitude. The first president, George Washington, was a traditionalist. He didn't like things to be changed too much and too quickly. And his vice president, later who succeeded him as president, John Adams, was of a similar attitude. So, American Revolution was started by Republicans, with a small r, people who are for a republic. And other than the monarchists in the British colonies, most of the population was Republican. But now it turns out that there were two kinds of Republicans, people who wanted a republic. Those who wanted a democratic republic, that's why these people are called democratic Republicans, and those who wanted, they were often accused of being in favor of an elected monarchy, of a strong presidency. That was the political struggle in the United States. That was the political struggle in France. That was the political struggle that happened in England or Great Britain, and so on and so forth. So the radical Republicans is the term used in France, but here in the United States they were called Democratic Republicans. They were Republicans because they were for a republic, not for a monarchy. Democrats because they believed that the American Constitution was not democratic enough. Thomas Jefferson would emphasize this point again and again. He even wanted kind of a British system where the leader of the executive branch would go directly to the House of Representatives and answer questions and debate them and so on and so forth. He kind of gave up on that idea eventually, but that was his ideal. Most importantly, Democratic Republicans, people like Thomas Jefferson, wanted greater powers for the House of Representatives because this branch of government was closest to the will of the people. The problem that other people saw with these ideas of the French Revolution, and Thomas Jefferson in particular, was that will of the people can easily become tyranny of the majority. And this happened in the French Revolution. So with the execution not only of the king, but also of the queen, and then finally their son, heir to the throne, was he died under suspicious circumstances in prison. The king who was executed was Louis XVI, so his son would be Louis XVII, and since he was killed in revolutionary prison, there was never Louis XVII. There was Louis XVIII after the revolution. And that's one of the oddities of French history. Anyways, be that as it may, I'm looking at slide number 3, the execution of Louis XVI, with his head being held by the executioner, saying this is the head of the traitor. King was put on trial. The so-called impeachment that we talked before, something that the British did in 1640. But now the French were doing it, and try to put yourself in the shoes of a person like George Washington, who in 1789 was elected president. He was elected president mostly because of the French help during the American Revolution. He knew that well, that were it not for the French Navy that bombarded Yorktown in 1783, who knows how the Revolutionary War would have ended. And King Louis XVI took a great personal risk. Basically, he bankrupted his own state by helping the American revolutionaries. And now this person was executed by the revolutionaries as a traitor. Americans reacted to this event in very different ways. George Washington felt that his ally was murdered in France. And some other people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, the author of the famous tract Common Sense, we'll talk about Paine a little bit later in the slides, were thrilled by it. Thomas Paine went to France to participate in the French Revolution, and he was elected to the French National Assembly. So I'm trying to give you this sort of an international perspective to the whole issue of the French Revolution, to see where these events in America are actually happening. Let's start with a couple of details, factual details. The French Revolution, as I said, lasted from 1789 to 1815. In 1789, the French rebelled against their king, and it ended with the proclamation of the French Republic in 1792. So for 3 years, they tried to negotiate with the king about a more representative kind of government. It didn't work. They accused the king of treason and the proclaimed the Republic in 1792, and King Louis XVI was executed in January of 1793. That would be during the first term of the Washington presidency. And that turned into a war, because once the French executed their king, other monarchies of Europe, and that would be Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, turned against France. So I'm leaving Spain aside, but you'll see later on why in a couple of weeks. Why is this important? The execution of the king immediately triggered the war. The war that started in 1792-93, and it ended only in 1815, when Napoleon, the president of the French Republic, the first president of the French Republic, was sent into exile on a remote island in South Atlantic called St. Helena, where he died in 1821. So Napoleon started as the president of the French Republic in 1799, trying to settle things down, and he declared himself later an emperor, but kind of an emperor of the people. Contradiction in terms, well, Napoleon was a man full of contradictions. So, democratic revolution initiated by Napoleon was often following the principle expressed by a radical Republican, Maximilien Robespierre. In French, these people are often called the Jacobins, because they met in a place that was called Saint Jacques, and anyway, that's another story. But Maximilien Robespierre had a famous saying, there is no liberties for enemies of liberty. And it encapsulates the problem of radical revolutionaries. That is, well, if you want, what is the saying? If you want to make an omelet, you need to break some eggs. And revolutions work in a similar way. In other words, if you want to do a revolution, you have to kill some people. But you're doing the revolution because you want to help the people, and at the same time you're killing some of them. That's internal contradiction of that every revolutionary has to face, internal dilemma that every revolutionary has to face. So the French Revolution, actually, I'm looking now at the slide number 5. The French Revolution actually affected the presidency of 5 US presidents. And that would be George Washington, was president from 1789 to 1787 for 8 years. John Adams from 1797. Oh, that's a typo here. Okay. So George Washington, the president from 1789 to 1797. George Adams from 1797 to 1801. Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1809 for 8 years. James Madison from 1809 to 1817, another 8 years. And finally, James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. As you can tell, the first two presidents were Federalists. Well, George Washington tried to keep away from political parties. But the next three presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, were all Democratic Republicans, radical Republicans, or I call them simply Democrats because that's not inaccurate. Often these three presidents were called the Virginia dynasty in American politics. And this Virginia dynasty was interrupted only by the election of a more conservative John Quincy Adams in 1825. So that's the problem with this chapter, this interaction between the French, international events, the world war that was going on between the Republican France and the monarchies of Europe, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and on the other side. A good example of a person that kind of reflects the troubles of this period